Hello, everyone. Let's get started. My name is Chris Ott. I work as the Deputy Director for the High Speed Rail Alliance. I'm filling in today for our ED, Rick Harnish, who couldn't be here. The Alliance, for those who don't know us already, is a member-supported nonprofit organization, and one of the main things that we do is to educate the public, elected officials, and other leaders about the benefits that modern trains can bring. There are lots of those benefits, including things like the convenience and safety of trains, the way that they allow for time while you're traveling to be productive or just relaxing, if that's what you'd prefer, and then the way that they make communities stronger and drive economic growth. But as a technology, trains also have advantages that make them a key part of efforts to deal with the climate crisis. And unfortunately, we see more and more evidence of how serious that crisis is becoming all the time. Global temperatures keep setting new records. The Southeast United States has been hit by two terrible hurricanes in just the last few weeks. And the Washington Post reported a few months ago that even thunderstorms are causing much more serious damage than they used to. At the start of the 21st century, the US had just one or two thunderstorms each year that would do damage that cost $1 billion or more to repair. Last year, instead of just one or two of those storms, we had 28. So it's getting more and more serious. With us to talk about this are two experts from one of the country's preeminent organizations, the Sierra Club. For more than 100 years, the Sierra Club has worked to protect the natural environment and also to preserve the quality of the human environment. And last year, they outlined a detailed series of recommendations to improve both passenger and freight rail and to expand rail electrification. Our speakers are a part of the team that published this report. Katherine García is the director of the Sierra Club's Clean Transportation for All campaign. Her advocacy focuses on reducing transportation emissions to protect public health, improve air quality, and address the climate crisis. Before joining the national campaign in 2020, Katherine was an advocate for clean transportation at the Sierra Club California chapter, where she advocated for bold policies at the California Air Resources Board and the state legislature. She also currently serves on the National Center for Sustainable Transportation Leadership Council, as well as the League of American Bicyclists Board of Directors. And Yassi Kavezade has advocated for economic and environmental justice for more than 10 years. She has worked as a community organizer and to create public policy across regulatory agencies and governments. At the Sierra Club, she has organized and led 100% electric rail campaigns through the California Air Resources Board in-use locomotive rule, the decarbonization of rail yards through an indirect source rule, and supported the Sierra Club's recent rail statement. She looks forward to decarbonizing the rail sector in hopes of cleaner air and good jobs, and let's hear more about that. For everyone in the audience, thank you for joining us today. If you have a comment, please use the chat feature, and if you have a question, it makes things easier if you put things in the in Zoom's Q&A feature. We'll get to after the presentation. We'll get to as many of your questions as we can. And with that, I will turn things over to our speakers.
Thank you so much, Chris. And hello, everybody. Thank you for joining us today. We're excited to make this presentation about our report and also talk about our advocacy. Yassi, can we put up the slides, please? So I'm Katherine Garcia, and my colleague Yassi will be introducing herself in a moment. We can go to the next slide. Our talk today is Rail is Essential for the Fight Against Climate Change. And this is me. I included a couple of photos that kind of represent how passionate I am about trains. This particular one on the right is from several years ago. I took a cross-country trip from New York to Emeryville, California. So I took two trains, and this was just the highlight of the trip was sitting in the observatory car, seeing the landscape go by. It was in the month of January, so the scenery was wintry and beautiful. And then the second picture here is of me and my son. This is when he was 3 years old. It was last year. We took a train from Washington, D.C. to West Virginia to go hiking. And this really represents the love I have for trains and public transportation broadly, and how passionate I am about everyone being able to take public transportation, and how it should be convenient for families as well. Um, and next slide, and I'll pass it to Yassi.
Great. Hi, everybody. My name is Yassi Kavezade. I'm based in California, and I'm a senior advisor for the Clean Transportation for All campaign. I've lived my whole life in California and have seen public transportation and rail excel in the Bay Area with the BART system, and have been involved in watching the high-speed rail network be built out here and Brightline from Los Angeles to Las Vegas. I've also seen the needs that we are lacking here in California, and feel like what we're going through reflects the majority of the country living in rural and suburban neighborhoods that don't have access to passenger rail or high-speed rail. So I definitely believe in people power and organizing people power. You could see my picture. The top picture is when we were at the California Air Resources Board with a board member who has an environmental justice background, and passing the in-use locomotive rule. And CARB was a big priority for us. We were tracking the rule, making sure residents that are affected by rail pollution, that want to see freight rail decarbonized and excelled in the transportation sector, show up to these meetings in Sacramento that often aren't during hours that folks that have 9 to 5s can join at. So it was a really great win for us, and partnering. Sierra Club had the chance to partner with so many different organizations, including labor and environmental justice groups. I do live in a more rural community, but I do have a 10-minute drive to my local Metrolink station, which is really great. And so in my community, I love gardening and working off the land. And I have 9 chickens and a dog. Yeah, pass it back to Katherine.
Thanks, Yassi. So this is an outline of the talk we're going to give today. We're going to talk about the moment we're in, a little background on the Sierra Club. We'll go into detail on the recommendations from the rail report. We'll talk about our advocacy, so several initiatives that are related to rail and also public transportation broadly, and land use. And then talk a little bit about some of the current initiatives that some of our chapters are leading, and then a look ahead. And then we'll wrap up and move over to questions. So next slide. Okay, so Chris mentioned this a bit in terms of the climate crisis, climate emissions. I do usually like to start our conversations with talking about how transportation emissions exceeded electricity emissions for the first time in 2017. And this is part of what gets me up in the morning and is so excited to work with such a great team at the Sierra Club and our partners across the country, because we have so much at stake right now. And the biggest share of climate emissions in the US is coming from the transportation sector. So we have a lot of work to do, but I believe that this is an incredible moment for moving technology forward, and working with all broad groups to pass the boldest regulations possible, and with the incentives, the investments that are out there across the board at the state level and the federal level, I know we can get a lot done. So this is an optimistic moment for moving this work ahead. Next slide. Okay, and why do we do this work? So vehicles produce health-threatening air pollution, and this is causing severe health impacts. And we know that majority of the pollution comes from cars and trucks. But if we can work hard to improve the rail system, invest in more frequent rail, we can encourage more people to take trains, and minimize the harms from vehicles and reduce the number of vehicles on the road. But it is a shocking statistic that 45 million people in the US live within 300 feet of a major roadway. A lot of that has to do with inequitable land use decisions and a legacy of land use decisions that have place these roadways in specific areas, and we really need to reduce emissions from the transportation sector urgently. Next slide. Okay, so in speaking about those transportation inequities, we wanted to highlight this here. So freight pollution is an issue. So Yassi in a little bit is going to be talking about her advocacy on electric locomotives and some of the landmark regulations that have come to pass in California. We also talk about congestion. This particular photo demonstrates that, you know, we have highways that crisscross across the country that go right through communities, and people's homes are right next to these highways, and that is causing severe health impacts from heart disease and lung disease, and including chronic asthma that we see a lot in children and folks that live right near highways. So this is an important issue that we were trying to address. And then also I wanted to list unsafe streets. Sierra Club does a lot of work related to making sure that it's safer, easier, and more convenient to take trips that are not in cars. And so one aspect is really making sure that we have safe pedestrian infrastructure, and making sure that for folks that are trying to get to a train station or trying to get to a transit depot, that they are able to walk there safely or bike there safely to get there. Next slide. Okay. So the Sierra Club is the oldest grassroots organization in the United States. And we work to make sure that everyone, no matter where they live, no matter who they are, what zip code they live in, that they're able to breathe clean air, drink clean water, and really live in thriving communities. And the way I've shaped our clean transportation campaign is really making sure that we are creating those thriving communities across the country, and that we're able to get around in a convenient and safe way, and in a way that is really working to tackle the climate crisis. So this is a list of our priorities. We do this work through advocacy that's led by our staff and our volunteers. And we do have 64 chapters across the country. Most of those are state chapters. So I invite you, as you're listening to this presentation, to think about, you know, if you'd like to get involved with the Sierra Club, we definitely love to connect you with the chapters that are in your area. And then there are several chapters in California, and they're kind of broken up regionally. And so in terms of our advocacy, we push for strong vehicle regulations. We try to reduce emissions in ports, rail yards, and warehouse areas. We work to increase the funding that's available for trains and buses, making sure they're as clean as possible and that they're reliable and affordable. And then in terms of electric vehicles, making sure that they are powered by renewable energy, the charging that is set up and invested in. And then we also work to increase density by looking at infill land use development and affordable housing. Next slide. So this is a little bit about our initiatives related to reducing vehicle miles traveled. This particular photo was taken in Minnesota. It was a bike trip, a bike tour that our North Star chapter set up in Minnesota. And this particular photo, this is the group that's really working on transit to expand investment in transit. So I thought it was a fitting picture here. And this talks about how we are working to accelerate the adoption of electric cars, trucks, buses, and locomotives. And we also advocate for indirect source rules around ports, rail yards, and warehouses. And these are regional ordinances that really aim to reduce pollution through a variety of strategies to address the freight pollution that is concentrated in these areas. And this is a toolkit that we developed right after the announcement of the programs that were passed in the bipartisan infrastructure law, also known as the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act. And then when the IRA passed, the Inflation Reduction Act, which had a whole host of other transportation related investments, we decided to merge all of the programs. And this is a tool that allows our volunteers to know when there's applications open, what kind of resources they can use. A lot of times, if there's a good project that an entity is applying for, then Sierra Club, the particular Sierra Club chapter that's most relevant, will submit a support letter. And as the EPA and the Department of Transportation have rolled out these investment programs, we've collaborated with both the entity that's applying and also with the agency to make sure that the best projects are funded. And there's so much potential right now with the IIJA and the IRA implementation. We're seeing a lot of really good projects funded. And I will pass it to Yassi to talk about the rail report.
Thanks, Katherine. Hi, everybody. For those who are just joining, my name is Yassi. I'm a senior advisor alongside Katherine, who's our director of the Clean Transportation for All campaign at Sierra Club. And today we're also going to be talking about our rail statement. So for folks who haven't seen this, it's not a simple statement. It's actually an extensive white paper that took many hours and discussion and basically research. I had the privilege of working with a committee of core volunteers who had technical experience and background, formerly working in the rail industry on a national scale, on a regional scale with commuter rail. And then of course, folks that had engineering and electrification backgrounds as well, and have had an extensive experience and CV of doing this type of work. So I was in very good hands writing this paper alongside people that wanted to see and organize the Sierra Club to do more for rail electrification. And we published the white paper now. I believe it's been over a year, year and a half. So really encourage you to check out this first edition before we, get cracking on the next edition as we see rail hopefully expanding for movement across the country. And so there's different sections of the statement, and I'll be going through each of the sections briefly. Again, lots of information in the paper itself, and I encourage you to take a look and I'll do my best to answer any questions alongside Katherine at the end of the presentation. And thank you so much to Chris for recognizing our paper and having us here today. So the major section and first section of the rail paper is just validating the fact that rail can be electrified. And we believe that overhead catenary is the best way to do it. There are battery electric locomotives as well, but overhead catenary, as many of you may already know, is a technology that has existed for many years. On freight trains especially, which is my sort of background and specialty, we see freight trains moving with overhead catenary in India, in Europe all the time. And even for me, as someone who's on the West Coast and doesn't see it, sometimes see it in the East Coast as well. So we believe that that's the most sound decision, bringing down the cost of construction and making sure that demonstration projects, if we have federal funding or even state funding earmarked for this type of electrification, it goes to overhead catenary. And unfortunately, that's not a trend we've seen, especially on the freight sector side, go into overhead catenary. We do have passenger and commuter rail lines in the country that use overhead catenary. So the rail paper really focuses on what we're doing for freight. And you'll see different examples in the paper, like I've highlighted in these two pictures that are, I believe, one of them is a historical picture and another is based in Europe. The next section of the paper is the section I worked on the most, which is environmental justice and discussing the nuances between mode shift around the freight sector and making sure that passenger rail expansion also includes communities who live nearby trains, who are often of lower income and of color, and explaining the nuances between making sure that when we're expanding rail, we're really doing it when even Sierra Club, as we're advocating across different agencies, whether they're federal agencies or local transportation boards, that we really do a good job of including voices that live nearby communities. And how do you do that? You really ensure developing relationships with certain organizations, or you build a campaign around outreach and door knocking, and you work with local organizers to make sure they have the resources to bring in people from those nearby communities into the conversation. And we did that quite a bit with Sierra Club, partnered with environmental justice organizations, sending volunteers out to help gather input and contributions to the rail yard ISR. And we believe that environmental justice is crucial for railroad and rail use expansion. And we have several recommendations. So the things that are in bullet points are basically a summary of our recommendations from the rail paper we have for each section. And we need coordination with local transit and both rural and low income families to be at the center of how we're going to plan rail, and looking at emissions reductions that are at the bottom line of improving health. And I think somebody actually chatted that from Physicians for Social Responsibility. So thank you for uplifting that. The next section is freight rail, which again, is biased here. It's like my favorite section. And this is one of the biggest emission factors from rail. Unfortunately, many of the locomotives, I'm sure you've seen them or had to stand behind the rail crossing or in your car, as we do in Southern California. We have an immense throughput of freight that comes through on rail still. However, it can be more and it can be expanded. And the mode shift from trucking to freight is absolutely necessary to reduce emissions reductions. However, there is some nuance to that. Right now, freight trains are using locomotive engines that are, 40, 50 plus years and using the crudest of diesel. And so tier 0, tier 1 is basically where we're at with those types of locomotives, which are the most polluting, whereas tier 5 is the cleanest, which doesn't really exist in operations around the freight sector. So we really need more advocacy here. And as we're shifting more things onto rail, expanding or planning smart, because there are a lot of abandoned rail systems as well in the country, and figuring out how we mode shift away from trucks to rail is going to be super important. And we highlight all the technicalities of this and the history of this in the report, but I did want to point out that there have been far more subsidies for trucking and car companies for sure. Not as much as there has been for oil companies and gas companies, but there has been a little bit more in the coming years because of advocacy like Sierra Club. And we would like to see that history also change for railroads in as far as developing and building out overhead catenary, developing systems that expand high-speed rail or expand passenger rail. And so that all relates to freight rail, because the lines could be shared or there's right-of-way situations. So it needs to be done cohesively. And that's what the our rail statement basically elaborates more. Passenger rail. So I live, actually, believe it or not, Los Angeles has a subway system. I hope some of you knew about that. And I love taking our metro line into our office when I have meetings there. So passenger rail is super important to us at Sierra Club, and making sure that we raise access, and high-speed rail also is coupled with that as a type of passenger rail. and reducing emissions reductions from vehicle miles traveled is also talked about in the report, and making sure that we have on time, on pace, reliable commuter rail. Many folks still travel by car, and we want to see a passenger rail network expand across states in the country. And we also support the expansion and investment of Amtrak. Many of our volunteers are, retired and definitely have had the history of advocating for Amtrak and the funding of Amtrak. I had like an amazing lesson and storytelling from them about this. And so we capture all of that in the report and talking about how, unfortunately, so much of Amtrak service has been cut throughout rural America, and how do we bring that back, and how do we make sure that we're advocating at the Surface Board of Transportation, at the FRA, at these agencies that really need to put investments and planning for Amtrak, and eventually, hopefully, a high-speed rail network for the country for passenger rail would be amazing. And it's just, we're really excited to see more officials taking it seriously, and we hope to continue our efforts in educating the government on doing more to accelerate passenger rail systems. So excited about that. And then, of course, rail technicians and education is also lacking. I got this slide from the National Academy of Railroad Services, which is a school based in, I believe, another state, not in California. I forget where it's based off of, but basically this is the main school that I found that does railroad science teachings. I'm sure some community colleges or trade schools do offer certain types of training, but having a national educational system or a national accreditation system, which mirrors what happens in Europe and India, is going to be really important for us, and also helps labor unions understand a systemic certification so that they can hire and create apprenticeship programs for students. Some labor unions have rail apprenticeship programs for rail yard workers and possibly conductors and engineers. I'm not sure about the engineers and conductors piece, but I know for rail yards, and it's a very small pool because people don't have the prerequisites for pre-apprenticeship and experience to get trained on how to do rail. And part of that is because the demand isn't as needed for that type of work. So as we're thinking about, Katherine mentioned the Inflation Reduction Act and the IIJA, the Investments in Infrastructure Jobs Act, we need to think about how those monies are building out projects for infrastructure and growth, and how labor, good working jobs, good high paying jobs, reliable jobs through represented work are affected, because that's how we can create more allyship and a movement to get bosses and class 1 railroads to really change their business as usual practices. So at Sierra Club, we have been successful in doing some of that with electrical workers and UE, which represent building out, well, UE represents some of the locomotive drivers, and then with electrification of rail, some folks at the union have built out infrastructure for that type of work to exist, alongside in California in the Alameda corridor, which isn't being used, unfortunately. So we absolutely, one other thing that the report also highlights is having technical hubs or education hubs for on a regional network. And we've seen some of this play out around clean energy and solar. So having that type of clean energy mindset around rail and creating these hubs is going to be super important. Okay, and I think, yeah, and then I'll kind of go into, sorry, I thought I was frozen. I think I'll go into our advocacy now. So I'm going to be talking about 2 states. So we're seeing our chapter, well, our chapters have always been having their ears to the ground and looking at opportunities to advocate. And our Alaska chapter recently took a huge milestone by putting out an event to talk about the potential to expand commuter rail in Alaska. And they had members from the former task force around rail from Governor Walker's task force attend. They had vice president of the Alaska Railroad on that focuses on real estate attend, and just have a dialogue about what can we do to make commuter rail accessible, expandable, reliable, all of the things that people want for trains. And it was an excellent event, and they're hoping to follow up with the state and figuring out investments to create more access here, which is super exciting. And we hope on the national side, we can continue to support their work and really just being there to understand and highlight these types of state-based priorities into a national framework as well. The next piece is California. So California has done a bunch of work to electrify their locomotives, and we just won a big lawsuit that was being challenged by BNSF and Union Pacific, saying that we can regulate locomotive emissions if the federal government decides to grant a waiver for California to do so. So now the ball's in the federal government's court, and we're excited about the locomotive rule from the California Air Resources Board to be upheld, because this is going to signal for other states that are able to regulate their fuel emissions to do the same. And not only that, we have a initiative we passed, I think it's been 5 years now, maybe a little over 5 years, slightly over, but we passed a ballot initiative to invest in high-speed rail. And the High-Speed Rail Authority in California is a governor's appointed office that unfortunately needs more love and attention, but basically the authority is building out sections of high-speed rail as we speak in California, which is really exciting. And we hope to see it operational in the 2040s sometime. And Sierra Club, again, our local chapters are also monitoring this because the infrastructure is being built out in their communities, and we're happy to help wherever we can and advocating for more transparency and basically to get this high-speed rail built sooner rather than later. And then I'll pass it to Katherine to talk about other advocacy efforts that we're up to. Thanks.
Thanks, Yassi. So continuing on, I also have another 2 states. So wanted to highlight the good work of Georgia. Our Georgia chapter is hosting a meet and greet every other month, and they take this opportunity to meet with local groups and organizations that are advocating for transit. So here you can see the details. And if any folks on the call are in Georgia, I can certainly connect you with our Georgia chapter. Right now, they're working to pass a ballot initiative that will fund public transportation in Cobb and Gwinnett counties. Next slide. And then in Minnesota, this is a photo from 2 of our staff colleagues at the Minnesota chapter. The Minnesota chapter is called the North Star chapter, and they advocated for the Amtrak Borealis, which is a partnership with the Departments of Transportation in Illinois, Wisconsin, and Minnesota. So just in terms of some stats, they did start the second line or the second train in the summer, and I touched base with them this week to see kind of how they've seen ridership increase over the last few months. And he said that over 18,500 passengers rode the Borealis during its first month of service. This has really prompted more energy and excitement for advocating for a third line, a third daily train. So there's been a lot of momentum here. In 2023, the Minnesota legislature approved a package for 194.7 million. And it provides local matching funding needed to pursue federal grants for the project. The North Star chapter is strongly supporting the leadership of the All Aboard Minnesota in passenger rail advocacy. Slide. So this is an initiative that Sierra Club has with our sister campaign, Outdoors for All. So Outdoors for All really works to make sure that everyone has access to the outdoors, not only to enjoy nature, but also for the health benefits that we all experience in the wellness from being outdoors in green space or on a trail. And so this initiative, the Transit to Trails, also has a complementary piece of legislation in Congress right now that we're advocating in support of. But in order to bring this to every chapter and have initiatives and outings related to it, we have created different activities. And so this picture shows a particular outing which had 50 youth from Southern California, and they went over to a beach trip. And so we actually have a blog that we can put in the chat related to this. And it was in celebration of the Transit to Trails initiative. And what's fascinating is that many of these folks that took the train out had not taken the train to the beach before. And so that was, an exciting moment. We also have a story map related to Transit to Trails. It's called Epic Fails and Epic Trails. And so we encourage folks that have taken the train to either beach trips or hiking or green spaces or parks to list the trains that are working, or if they're not working, to raise awareness about that as well. Next slide. And so and I did see in the chat a little bit ago that someone was pointing out the giant subsidy that is the highway system, and that's absolutely true. Many state DOTs, departments of transportation, have prioritized more highways and used a lot of their funding for wider highways, when some of that money should be used for public transportation. We would see a lot less congestion, and we would see a lot less vehicle pollution if we invested more in public transportation and high-speed rail than in highways. And so we're really working to overhaul this system. We need to recognize induced demand. There have been some states that have really understood that more highways means more cars and more congestion. And the only way to reverse that is to invest more in rail and public transit. So leading states like Colorado and Minnesota have actually taken steps to start tracking how their transportation investments leads to more GHG emissions, and working to overhaul and realign those priorities so that the decisions that they're making related to transportation investments actually align with their climate targets. And I think given that, we will see less money used for expanding the highway system and more for actually investing in alternatives to driving. So I did actually, Yassi, let's move back one slide. That was kind of an intro to our Smart Growth and Urban Infill project. We have on our website, we have several recordings of webinars that we've given related to infill. And in this webinar series, there's a longer document, and then we have a webinar that each covers land use, housing for all, active transportation and transit, and labor and resilience. And so I encourage folks that are interested in this aspect to check out the recordings and the guidance at sc.org/infill. But this is a big part of our advocacy because we know that looking at how we're using how we are developing land use is super important for us to tackle the climate crisis. Okay, and then just recently, last year, we took the infill guidance one step further, and we worked with our volunteers to release a land use survey. And this includes examples of good development from across the country. And so almost every state is represented. And there are examples such as infill development, active transportation, transit hubs, and good examples of this moving forward. Okay, so here we're gonna kind of go Yassi rapid fire through these. So what you can do, this is the close of our presentation. I wanted to list a couple of items here. Election day is coming up, and we really see this as an inflection point. We spoke a lot about the federal investments from the IIJA and the IRA. And if we want this momentum to continue, we really need to make sure we're voting come November. And for those of you that have the opportunity to help or are able to, we encourage getting out the vote and reaching out to voters. We also encourage you to get involved with the Sierra Club. As I mentioned before, we have 64 chapters. I already saw in the chat there are some members here, so we'd love to engage with you further, and really appreciate you all being here today. At the Sierra Club, we have frequent petitions, both on the local side and also at the federal side. We encourage folks to attend rallies, attend meetings and workshops, and get involved in the policies we're advocating for, and to even volunteer and join the executive committees or be a lead volunteer on a committee that is at the chapter. I also included a couple of books that I found really inspiring. I know the authors of these particular books, so I wanted to give them a shout out. Inclusive Transportation is written by Veronica Davis, who is a leader in this space, talks a lot about equity and inequities and how we can move forward, especially with public transportation. And then Anna Ziverts wrote When Driving is Not an Option This Year. And this really goes to demonstrate that so many people not only don't choose to drive, but can't drive. And so we need to make sure that we are investing in a public transportation system that works, that's reliable, and that helps everyone get around. Anna Ziverts is actually the founder of the initiative Week Without Driving that just passed. Sierra Club is one of the national partners for Week Without Driving. And we had several events around the country, and many people committed to the initiative to talk about how we need to invest more in public transportation. Next slide. And then just a couple of podcasts I wanted to mention and highlight as good examples. Talking Headways talks a lot about the need for public transportation. They always have good folks that they're interviewing, and I find I learn a ton on a weekly basis when I listen to this podcast. And then Arrested Mobility talks a lot about the inequities in transportation broadly, and is also a really informative podcast. Okay, and thank you so much. That's the end of our presentation.
Thank you. Thanks to both of you for explaining this report that you've done, and of course for all the work that you and your coworkers have done to all the work that went into it. We appreciate it. I encourage everyone. I hope everyone will check out the resources that you mentioned from the Sierra Club, and if you are enjoying this broadcast and want to see more like it, please check out the High Speed Rail Alliance as well. You can go to highspeedrail.us, sign up for our newsletter if you haven't already, become a member. That's what makes this ultimately that's what makes this possible. So please join us if you haven't already. We do have a bunch of questions. First of all, we had a request for a copy of the slides that we've just seen. I'll let our speakers decide later whether or not they want to do that, but we will make a recording of this talk available within about a week or so. And in fact, we have a collection of dozens of previous talks at hsrail.org/events. So you can find our library there, and we'll get this one there as soon as we can. Moving into the other questions, John Kolbeck, one of our volunteer leaders, who actually just incidentally in another conversation mentioned the other day that he's been a longtime member of the Sierra Club, asks, when you're out in the community or attending town hall meetings, what are some common talking points you hear from opponents of clean transit initiatives, and what are some ways that you respond to those and overcome them?
I can start there, and Catherine, maybe you can kind of give a larger view. Some of the talking points are typical cost concerns, and that's, you know, a shame because they look at least for communities like mine in the Inland Empire, where bus systems and ridership has declined, and you know, how a lot of these transit agencies supply themselves with ridership. So unfortunately, it comes down to cost sometimes, or it comes down to, you know, local development have you know, there's opposition from neighborhood associations or neighbors. And then when it comes to things like regulating technology and raising standards on technology, that's a different type of talking point that comes from the industry and corporations like the class one railroads who sued us. So there's a lot of talking points there about the technologies and, you know, available, and they show up to talking town halls and bring oftentimes their staff and, you know, resist any kind of mandate to improve their technology. So and yeah, so that's just how we overcome them is basically building relationships with this organization here, like the Alliance, with members and volunteers who have networks themselves, whether they have a bus riders union or a transit advocate group that they've started or are a part of a more formal organization, really making sure that we're as inclusive as possible in the strategy. And my background and experience in working with coalitions I think has been one of the most successful ways of getting things passed and done, to show agencies and decision makers, hey, it's not just Sierra Club or this one transit group, it's a collective of people from different backgrounds coming together and overcoming the opposition, saying that this is possible. Catherine, did you want to add anything else?
I'll just add that, you know, stories are so powerful. So sometimes it's just a matter of really encouraging folks to speak up, you know, and that's why when we partner with environmental justice groups, you know, we make sure that they have the capacity and resources to elevate their voice, to be organized with us, attend meetings together, workshops, meet the commissioners that are making these decisions, and really, when we approach these campaigns, it's a matter of not just talking about the cost to change technology, but really the cost savings for the health impacts. So particularly if there are members of the coalition with asthma or with health impacts that they can talk about, you know, from the freight pollution, we raise those stories. We partner with doctors. Sometimes there's doctors that write op-eds or provide testimony or analysis, or we'll write a report related to a specific project. And so really thinking through the health benefits and the cost savings from missed days of work or doctor appointments and medication, and then also the environmental benefits as well. And so, you know, as we saw in Minnesota, you know, they are increasing ridership at a very quick pace. And so we know that from those examples, those are many car trips or truck trips that would not be taken because they have the additional lines.
All right, thank you. Next question. Wade asks, has the Sierra Club looked at incentives for freight railroads to help improve and expand passenger service?
This is something that we really are hoping to track more of. Again, I'm pretty new to the space, but I think in the past we've done a really good job of monitoring what's happening at the federal level and with the IIJ and IRA exclusively naming, and at EPA to include locomotive emission standards in their latest phase of the greenhouse gas rule. So we're looking at incentives, we're looking at ways to demand those incentives, because that's actually what's missing often when we're tackling monopolies like the railroads. So we definitely are and want to and continue to, and naming that the biggest incentives we have advocated for that has been the recent IRA and IIJA initiatives here. And then, sorry, locally, we also want to work on local measures. In Los Angeles, for example, there's a big measure to get more funding to Metro so that commuter rail is ready for the Olympics in 2028. Our biggest goal there is making sure we have a car-free Olympics. So, you know, our chapters, many of the volunteers who I see in the chat, thanks for joining, and please shout out if you're involved in your chapter in the chat. I love to see it, and I hope to follow up with you. But yeah, our chapters are monitoring the incentives on a more local and regional level as well. And we're here to support them.
Okay, thanks.
Oh, I was just going to add that, you know, the Federal Railroad Administration is getting ready to announce the allocations for the Christie grant. And so that's something that we're tracking very closely. So that's the Consolidated Rail Infrastructure and Safety Improvements Program. So we're hoping that there'll be some great projects that will fund this year.
There was also a follow-up question from someone else. How can we make sure that freight and passenger rail aren't seen as adversarial?
Do you
want to do that one first, Catherine, this time?
You can take this one.
Thanks.
Particularly, but I think from your perspective in California.
Yeah, so that was actually big. The adversarial relationship came up actually in California Air Resources Board's in-use locomotive rule, where a lot of passenger rail operators quickly opposed the rule because they, you know, thought that they were going to be under the same sort of standards as the Class 1 railroads that operate freight. So we did a good job of intervening early and advocating for different types of standards, because again, the sort of monetization of passenger rail versus freight is really different, and they work in different markets and have different demands. So we made a clear discrepancy in the rulemaking process so that the passenger rail agencies ended up supporting us and supporting the rule, and didn't sue us after we passed the rule in CARB. So sue the state rather. So that was a big moment. And I think it does depend. Oftentimes, you know, they collaborate on the operations side all the time, and they probably have their own conflicts and situations where they have to duke it out. But when it comes to like agencies and incentives, we try to have be actually a big intervener with agencies to say, look, like these cannot be lumped the same, and, you know, operate with different conditions. And we do our best to not harm any kind of stifle any kind of growth on the passenger rail side. That's just my experience in California, at least.
Okay, thanks. And speaking of California, Alex asks a question about the California high-speed rail project and the role that environmental regulation plays. Environmental regulation can be seen as slowing things down and raising the costs of projects. Can you say more about that? And is there a balance that can be struck?
Yeah, there is a balance that can be struck. California has its own environmental process called CEQA, California Environmental Quality Act, and it's probably one of the most robust processes out there. It is lengthy and time consuming. However, with subsidized projects like high-speed rail, there are some exemptions, and there are some basically ways of fast tracking the projects. And in some communities that are a little bit more sensitive to the fast track, like Stockton, for example, or I think there's another one up north that folks felt like the fast track was curtailing, species that were either threatened or harmed in the way of in which the construction of the line was happening. I know of some environmental interveners that asked for a little bit of a slowdown. And so, yeah, that can add time and money. So we try to have a balanced approach and making sure that even though things will be fast tracked, like how will there still be transparency from developers? How will the jobs still stay local to folks? We don't want fast track doesn't mean like not informing residents or not informing local municipalities on the different phases. It does help build things out quicker, but that doesn't mean we need to sacrifice transparency or risks that there are there. So that's how I try to balance it. I literally just gave you my thought process. It's not easy, it's complicated, and it really depends on the case. High-speed rail has its own slew of problems that are not like the core of it. Honestly, environmental regulations are part of it, but there's also different kinds of allocations that have slowed the project down and have brought in an inspector general. And so it unfortunately it has its own issues there as well, besides environmental regulations.
Okay, thanks. And incidentally, we at the Alliance, we hosted a talk a while back from Professor Eric Goldwyn from New York University about why American transportation projects cost a lot more than they do in some other countries. And one of the major factors that he's found is that political friction has played a role. And so, when there isn't like a clear mandate to go forward, it slows projects down, and that leads to cost overruns. So that's a big part of this too. And incidentally, Professor Goldwyn is giving a talk in this same time slot next week on the need for a federal railway program, which is a top goal for the Alliance. And so if you want to learn more, please tune in this time next week. Carol, we have just a couple minutes left. Carol asks, are there plans to build bike lockers at public parking places so that people won't have their bikes stolen, when they go to the train station? Would you like to respond to that, or say more about the need for train stations to be intermodal for bikes and other kinds of transportation?
Yeah, I can take this one. This is something that we are looking into. I don't know of, maybe Yassi has like specific examples from California, but we are seeing more and more of this. There was actually just an article in Washington, D.C., where I'm based, where there's actually bike lockers that are now at the National Airport. And we have seen more and more of this at various transit hubs in Washington, D.C. as well, and at Union Station. So I think there is more of this. There's definitely more of a need for this, particularly, as I said before, having it be easier and more convenient to not take a car to get to a transit hub or a train station. So thank you for mentioning that. I think that's a great idea. We can definitely take that back to our chapters to elevate that and see how to get more advocacy around that.
Thanks. There is also there's a question and some discussion about hydrogen-powered locomotives. We're not going to have time to get into that today, but I will refer the people interested in that to another talk that we had from DB about a year and a half ago. It's in our library, about the pros and cons of various forms of power for train systems. Let's go with this is a good concluding question, I think, from John, who asks how can the Sierra Club, the High Speed Rail Alliance, and other like-minded organizations that might come from different backgrounds but share similar or complementary viewpoints on subject like decarbonizing the transportation system work together to make positive changes at the local and federal level?
Yes, this is a perfect question. And thank you. This has actually come up in some of our conversations with Chris and even in our initial conversation in terms of trying to set up this webinar. And so great question. So Sierra Club loves to work with partners and coalitions that are advocating for similar projects. We can work together on things like legislation at the state or federal level. We can work together to pass strong regulations as well. So we're definitely open to discussions. We have our emails here if you want to contact us personally. And Chris and I are continuing these conversations. We see this as just the start of a partnership.
Yes, hope so. But for now, we're gonna have to wrap it up. So thank you, Katherine Garcia and Yassi Kavezade, for for all the work that you've done in this presentation today, and to you and all your colleagues for this report that you did. And let's stay in touch. And thank you to everyone who joined us today, listened, submitted questions. If you haven't already, please become a member of the High Speed Rail Alliance. You can go to highspeedrail.us. There's a become a member button, a yellow become a member button right there at the top of the page. And we hope to see you again. Thank you all.
Bye. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. Have a good day.